Let's try this again. Last week, I made a video about historical and moral revisionism in media. And everything went okay until, of course, I started critiquing things that people like. And again, the point of that video, I think, was very misunderstood. So I'm here to explain myself once again. And I'm not apologizing. I'm actually doubling down on my position and restating, hopefully more clearly, why it is I believe what I believe about history, specifically medieval history. I think there's just been a general misunderstanding of my position, especially in the comments and responses to that video, so allow me to clarify. Medieval societies were not morally perfect or sexually pure by any means. That's not the point of what I was trying to say. Obviously, many things happened in isolation or otherwise, and people committed all sorts of acts. This is well known. Disputing that would be futile, and it's sort of totally irrelevant to my argument. The problem, again, is quantity. It's the amount and the spirit in which these are portrayed that paints a false picture of medieval history. And beyond that, it's a cynical view that teaches us to hate our ancestors and hate the people of the past rather than appreciate them for who they were, despite their shortcomings. Of course, the video last week dealt with 4 different pieces of media: HBO's Rome, The Northman, The Last Duel, and the beloved Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2. Through each of these examples, I laid out why they did a good job or a poor job or a mediocre job at displaying historical morality for the time. And, of course, this drew a lot of criticism. Isn't it awfully convenient in media that the church is portrayed as practicing the very opposite values it claims to espouse? Wouldn't you think that once in a while they would get it right? It's not a totally corrupt institution after all, right? Well, not according to modern media pieces and Hollywood, apparently. So let's go through some of these comments and respond exactly and precisely. So I'm going to read them out and then read my response. One critique here I do have about your take on Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2 is that Christendom as a homogeneous and Europe-wide entity wasn't really a thing, even by the end of the Middle Ages, and the expectations of a game depicting urban Paris or England can't really apply to do somewhere in Central Eastern Europe like Bohemia. Bohemia itself, while a part of the Holy Roman Empire, was culturally distinct from northern Italy or Saxony, which were also a part of the Holy Roman Empire. The referencing of the Benedictine rule is a great way to show how scholars and theologians like Saint Benedict viewed morality and religion, but can't really be applied as a blanket expectation for how medieval people would act and behave. Furthermore, medieval society was very religious. However, at this time, religion wasn't as we understand it today, and dictated less of an individual's morals and actions and more of an active political entity that also provided community and relief for the common people at the time. I also feel as if this critique disregards how, while morals have changed and society has changed, but people and how we act and react on a fundamental level hasn't. This is the same medieval Europe that, according to scripture, was to be chaste, would see knights and nobles wearing outrageously sized codpieces 100 years after Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2 takes place. We shouldn't change the past like some media does, but at the same time expecting what we understand of history in a time and place to be universally applicable and standard isn't much better. And this comes from a friend of mine, Demented Chicken. So my response to this is pretty simple. This is actually a good comment, and it has a lot of good critiques. The problem with this comment, and like a lot of these comments, is it's not actually directly addressing what I'm saying. It's kind of speaking past my point. Now, I still appreciate what he's saying here, and I take accountability maybe for not presenting my argument as clear as I could have, allowing these sort of misinterpretations to take place. Of course, Europe was not homogeneous, and each region and city had its own cultural differences, just like today. But there was a unifying part of Christendom, namely Christianity through the Catholic Church, that was a unifying and bounding tie and was regulated by the church. One of the problems with this comment I have specifically is the idea that religion didn't dictate an individual's morals and actions. Actually, it did, especially in individuals' morals. It was their moral code. Now, Christianity is not about legalism. It shouldn't be about right and wrong as far as what you do on a day-to-day. We all sin, after all, and any theologian or somebody who's read the New Testament knows that there's a legalistic difference between Christianity and the rest of the world's religions. However, to imply that a moral code brought in by Christianity wouldn't influence and thereby direct people's actions is foolish, to say the least. Faith may come before works, but it's through good thoughts and good faith in Christ and his teachings that we come to do good works, and it shapes our actions out of love for him. That is the point. So to pretend that a very Christian Europe would not act this way as a whole or strive to act that way is a little bit disingenuous, in my opinion. And I think this is a result of everything that's been shoved down our throats as far as it relates to historical Christianity. We are often never given an accurate depiction or a fair depiction of Christian Europe. It's always presenting the bad side or the downfall or the Crusades or the Inquisition. Yes, these things happened. Yes, the church had its problems. Yes, medieval Europe wasn't perfect. I shouldn't have to say that over and over again to make my point without you understanding I'm already taking those things into account. It's the thematic background of this setting, not the individual attributes. Yes, you can point to the cod pieces. Yes, you can point to the brothels. You can point to all these things. That doesn't prove my point wrong, because I was never claiming those things didn't happen. I'm claiming that the morality that did tie Christendom together would have had a far bigger impact on people than it's often portrayed. And that was my critique. Thanks anyway to Demented Chicken. I appreciate the comment. And again, I think my point was sort of just missed here. Coming up, I'm going to further address the rule of St. Benedict and why I chose that specifically as a source, even though it's not directly in this place or this time. And actually, I'm going to do that right now because it's the next comment. Man, you had me until you used the rule of St. Benedict, which is a book that precepts and then somehow infer from that book of precepts that society actually lived like that. If you want me to prove that the movie gets things wrong, you should be looking for accounts of that time, not a rule book that tries to tell people how to live. You just sound butthurt that your favorite team isn't depicted as great as you thought they should be depicted. You're not fighting historical revisionism, you are historical revisionism. Again, this is a fair critique, but not of my point. It's a different point. It's a straw man point, and I'll tell you exactly why. I considered using more close primary sources at the time. However, I'm not claiming to be an expert of medieval Bohemia or any of the areas depicted. I'm talking about the grander macro morality that would have outlined people's behaviors and beliefs on a wide scale. Of course, there are variances and there are exceptions, obviously. The point of St. Benedict and the rule of St. Benedict is this was a text that was beloved. It was one of the most important books in the time and has been studied since it was written by monks and the church, which had a direct influence on society and how they taught people how to live. It wasn't that every peasant was reading the rule of St. Benedict and saying, oh, if I violate page 37, then I'm going to hell, or I need to do this, and that because of St. Benedict. That's not the point. It's the spirit that underlies the behavior that's missing. The spirit. The setting is cold. It is devoid of light and grace and faith. And that's not an accurate picture of medieval Christianity. It just isn't. You can show the sin. You can show the struggle to follow God's word as they viewed it. But you cannot pretend that they were secular. You cannot show medieval people like you show modern people, walking around, living life the exact same way. They were not like us. They had different upbringings and different values that were embedded into their life at a much higher degree than most modern people understand. As far as if I'm historical revisionism, this is a claim that's also going to come up later. I just find that to be kind of funny. Of course, I'm looking at history through my lens, as everybody does. But just because it's not the lens you're looking at doesn't mean that I'm not right. And the fair part of this point is we all try to root for our own team in history, whatever that may be. And I'm sure I'm victim of that too. But if you really took an honest account of the depiction of Christianity over the last several years in media, I think you'd find I'm the outlier. This isn't a popular position, which is why we're getting so much feedback and criticism. It actually proves my point. It proves that we've been so warped and our perception has been so distorted by this barrage of disinformation of history and this cynical view of our ancestors and who came before, that it's overtaken the mass population. And that's what we're fighting against. And obviously, it's going to get criticism. I bet this video is going to get criticism, but it doesn't matter. The point of this is to show that there's nuance. The point of this is to show some of the areas that are lacking, not to poo-poo these games or these media that do a great job at building a historical setting in theory, in material, but not in spirit. Okay, this next comment's long, so I'm going to read some of it, but not all of it, because I think you'll get the point, and I'll put it on screen for those of you who want to read the whole comment. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Monks. Do bear in mind it's not set in generic medieval times, but Bohemia is run up to the Hussites. It wouldn't surprise me if anti-monastic views would be more normal at this point than other medieval times and places. I understand that. This is still pre-Reformation. This is not a time where criticism of the church was as widespread as it is today as a result of the Reformation. So that's a fine claim, and it's one I'm happy to research further, and perhaps I spoke too hastily. Maybe people were slandering monks every 3 minutes, and maybe monks were the laughingstock. I just find that hard to believe.
Hey guys, future Credenzio here. Turns out I was wrong about the monk thing, so my bad on that. The Hussites actually were very much against clericalism, and although the Hussite rebellions are a few years after the events of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, it's very likely that people would have been highly skeptical of monks. So that's my fault. I still think the rest of my critique about the general sentiment of Christianity being represented poorly can still stand and hold water. But at the same time, we have to take it all with nuance, like I've been saying.
And I also think it's a cynical view that shows a division in society that might not necessarily have been there. And I think that if you were raised and instructed by monks and priests your whole life as a part of your society, I think you would have a little more respect for them, in my opinion. As to sex in medieval times, I think there's a problem, and our popular view is a revisionist one. The Victorians set our views about the past and heavily warped reality to fit their then modern morals of sex is bad. Definitely true media can flip to the opposite extreme. That's true. Open adult relationships and nuance is important. I think Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the thing is it focuses on interesting events in your character's life rather than the normal days where nothing special happens. This makes encounters with women feel far more common. They did happen, though. Of course they did. Yeah, of course they did. I know that. I'm not trying to claim that they didn't. If you watch the first video, I never claimed that it didn't happen or that these encounters wouldn't happen. I'm saying that the frequency, the quantity distorts our view and it paints a wrong picture in spirit. The devil is really in the details on this, guys. So you just have to be aware of what is the motive behind the producers of this content. Is this how medieval people would have wanted to be represented? If you could put a medieval person today, is this how they would have shown society? That's something to consider. Also, it's hard to blame the Victorians for our understanding of history if you actually just look at primary sources. If you're looking at primary sources, you'd have to make the claim that Victorians somehow altered these, which I haven't seen any evidence for. So undoubtedly, periods of history have been influenced by other periods of history, but this seems to be a shallow point. This one's one of my favorites. It really is. I do not comment often on YouTube videos, but man, your take on the Vikings is wildly inaccurate. They were tradesmen and did sustain good relationships with neighbors. I'm not a Christian, but I'm part of Western civilization. There's a good part of non-Christian history you're missing. I think if you watch my video, I tell you that it's not a black and white picture. But stop trying to draw false equivalencies. The Vikings were nowhere near our modern sensibilities and moralities. Yes, they had good relationships with other Viking neighbors. If you happened to be a neighbor that wasn't being plundered and pillaged, you might have thought of them fine because it was just a part of your culture. This one's just a little silly, and I think that a lot of people have been romanticizing the Vikings for a very long time, and it's time for a bit of a reality check. And you often don't see people talking about colonizers this way, and yet colonizers were often way less barbaric than the Vikings were, and they don't get a pass, so why should the Vikings get a pass? In fact, why should anybody get a pass? It's not about giving moral exemptions or not. It's just showing history as it was. You try to paint a fair picture throughout. It's going to be hard because we have our own biases, as do I. Of course, I look at the Vikings differently than I look at the Christian societies. As a Christian, that's obvious that my bias is going to take effect, but it goes both ways. Okay, now for my real favorite comment, which was just really silly, and I enjoyed this one a lot. Sex never happened in medieval society? Bruh, we know 100% that people had affairs all the time. Even the most prudish periods in human history, prostitution, affairs, etc. happened all the time. The story is literally about a bastard. And then I had a cheeky reply. Of course, that's exactly what I said. We were all spawned by storks, didn't you know? Please remember what I actually said in the video. These things happened. The scale and quantity in modern media paints an inaccurate view of historical societies because of modern people's understandings. This is just kind of a straw man, and I just thought it was funny because obviously sex was happening. The point on specifically chastity was chastity before marriage being a virtue that we don't really understand anymore in today's society, not to the level that medieval people did. And the urgency certainly isn't nearly as high as it would have been. Of course, sex outside of marriage happened in medieval society. The question is how often and if people were tolerant of it, not to mention if it was encouraged or a part of the culture. This is another comment that I really like. Media has never been factual, so I guess it started out ruined. Fair enough. This video tries to present a nuanced topic in an intellectual way, but if you look behind the talking points, it's hollow. You're being a revisionist yourself by saying things like Judeo-Christian and speaking of conservative sex culture. Medieval Europe has issues with sexual morality. Slaves in Rome were still treated with humanity. You are warping. Well, again, the sex culture I speak of isn't conservative or liberal. It's a Christian sex culture. It comes from a Christian morality. It shouldn't have anything to do with liberalism or conservatism. The idea that this is somehow influenced, as other comments said, by some sort of 1950s morality is just absurd. If you think the 1950s is the most conservative it can get by your definition, you're in for a rude awakening when you start studying history. I think the problem with this subject in general is that history is not a science, and that anybody can point out a primary source or an example of X, Y, or Z, but completely miss the point. It's an easy assessment. Do you want to look at history with a cynical lens, judging our ancestors, or do you want to look at it with a less biased and honest lens, even giving them the benefit of the doubt? Now, does that contradict my Viking point? No. Just read the history. Just look at what the Vikings were doing. I think Vikings are cool. I love the aesthetic of the Vikings. I think it's awesome in a sense. I wouldn't want to live there. I wouldn't want that to be the morality that we have, and I thank God that that's not the morality that we have. Just because I think it's interesting and cool to study doesn't mean that I think it's morally permissible today. And I don't want to judge Vikings morally by my standards. I just want to call it as I see it. It's not the same morality that we have today. It's not even close. And yes, our morality today is influenced by Christianity heavily. It's easy to see that as soon as you start looking. The British Isles were pillaged and burned so fiercely that it was profitable. Even Mediterranean slavers traveled as far as Ireland to capture slave. A good question is, what if the Christian kings could have done the same? Wouldn't they have used this superior mobility to steal more riches and land? And my reply to that is that's what people claim colonialism was. When the European powers far surpassed in technology and accessibility of trade their neighbors in Asia and North and South America, they started a colonial process. It's a natural human instinct to conquer and to spread your culture around. Doesn't mean it's good, and we shouldn't justify colonialism just like we shouldn't justify Viking culture. Again, this isn't an apologetic of colonialism. I'm saying that you have to weigh the scales, and the morality that informs these cultures would also be a balance or a check on the actions that they would perform. So, again, colonialism's not good. The actions of colonists, not good, just before somebody tries to strawman me and say that that's what I was saying. One more note on the Vikings. I think it's totally fair if you want to critique me for being way more harsh on them than I am on the Christian Europeans. And obviously that's because of my own bias, and I'm going to see that way. And that's just how it is. Now, I think that anybody with a sense of humanism and value for human life will see that the Viking societies just simply did not value human life outside of their own culture almost at all. And that's something that's really concerning to me. And it's something that's the biggest reason why I have such strong criticisms of some of these cultures and societies. I still think they're interesting to see displayed. And I don't think we should sit here shaking our fists at the deeds of people of the past from either way. So it's just important to try to look at these things fairly. If we try to turn a blind eye to what the Vikings did because the Christians were doing bad stuff too, we're not going to get the picture right. And actually, it's going to be distorted because, as I've said several times already, the Christian morality of medieval Europe is way closer to us, even if it's still far, than the Viking morality was. There are many other comments that I could respond to. Some were very lengthy, like essays long, and probably outside the scope of this video. You can feel free to read them and my responses in that video. I think the most important theme from these comments is a total misinterpretation of what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying that these things didn't happen. I'm not saying that medieval society was some utopia. It's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that the spirit of medieval society, informed by a Christian morality, is totally missing from many of these media depictions. And that's exactly what we're trying to fix with Lionhearts. Lionhearts is a game that we are creating on Steam through Unreal Engine 5. And we're making this game to actually allow you to participate in history during the time of the Crusades in the Holy Land. What we're trying to do is give a fair moral account of the religiosity and the spirit of that age. You as a player are going to be able to make your decisions for good or ill, but at the end of the day, the setting should be as pure as possible towards what medieval people would have actually been like and how they would have acted. So if you want to support this project and you agree with me on my takes on history and how we should view it, or if not, please leave a comment. Let me know how you feel. I'd love to see how you guys feel. I'm sure I'm wrong about all sorts of things, and I'm open to change. I'm open to admitting when I'm wrong. The important thing here, too, is if you want to support that Lionhearts project, please go to our Kickstarter and join our Discord. Come into the discussion. If you're an avid fan of history, we love having this. Is just a heated talk. This doesn't need to be a debate. Doesn't need to be an argument. This is just something I'm passionate about. And of course, my opinions are controversial. That's sort of the point. And I hope that you guys just found them to be interesting. If you did, subscribe. We're going to be doing more analysis, talking about the virtues of history, the virtues of some things displayed in media, trying to take a more optimistic approach and deny the sort of modern cynicism that comes with looking at history. Thanks.